Hi, I'm Maya Rodriguez. Last month at my grandmother's funeral, my brother Carlos stood at the podium and announced they'd donated my entire military trust fund to charity in my honor. The room erupted in applause for his generosity. What they didn't know was that I'd never signed those papers. What they didn't know was that my grandfather's lawyer had been recording every family meeting for 20 years, and the tape from the day they forged my signature was about to surface. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. For years, they treated me like I was broken, like coming home from 2 tours in Afghanistan had left me too damaged to handle money or make decisions. They whispered about PTSD when they thought I couldn't hear, used words like unstable and need supervision when discussing my future. But the morning that lawyer played that recording, watching my family's faces drain of color as their own, voices filled the room. I realized something. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you signed papers without reading them? Have you ever been so grateful for family support that you ignored the red flags? Because this is the story of how my family's greed turned my trust into their weapon, and how a dusty old cassette tape became my salvation. The morning everything unraveled started like any other Tuesday in Phoenix. I was sitting in my small apartment near the VA hospital, the same place I'd been living since returning stateside 3 years ago. The walls were bare except for my discharge papers and a single photo of my unit in Kandahar. My phone rang at exactly 8:15 a.m., the ringtone cutting through the desert silence that had become my constant companion. Maya? It's Jonathan Fitzgerald from Fitzgerald and Associates. The voice was formal, careful. I recognized the name but couldn't place the face. I was your grandfather's attorney. I need to see you today. It's urgent. My grandfather, Roberto Rodriguez, had passed away 8 months earlier. The man who'd raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was 12. The man who'd worked double shifts at the copper mine to put money away for my future. The man who'd promised me that no matter what happened, I'd always be taken care of. Is this about the trust fund? I asked, though I already knew the paperwork had been handled. My brother Carlos had taken care of everything while I was dealing with what the doctors called readjustment issues. He'd brought me papers to sign, explained that Grandpa had left specific instructions about charitable donations, and I'd trusted him completely. Family was everything to the Rodriguez name, or so I'd been taught. Please, just come in. Noon today. And Maya? Fitzgerald's voice dropped lower. Don't mention this call to anyone, not yet. The drive to his office took me through downtown Phoenix, past the courthouse where I'd once dreamed of law school before the Army recruiter had painted pictures of adventure and purpose. The city looked different now, sharper somehow, like someone had adjusted the contrast on a photograph. Everything felt more intense since coming home. Colors too bright, sounds too loud, trust too fragile. Fitzgerald's office sat in an old adobe building that had probably been there since Arizona was still a territory. The waiting room smelled like leather and old paper, with the kind of quiet that made you want to whisper. When he finally called me back, I was surprised by how young he looked, maybe 45, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too many family secrets. Maya, thank you for coming. He gestured to a chair across from his massive wooden desk. I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Did you ever, at any point, authorize anyone to donate your trust fund to charity? The question hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean? Carlos said Grandpa had specific wishes about donations. He brought me the papers to sign. Fitzgerald's expression darkened. Your grandfather never specified any charitable donations in his will. The trust was meant to be yours, unconditionally upon his death. The entire amount, $437,000, was supposed to transfer to your name. My hands started shaking, the familiar tremor that came when my body remembered. Things my mind tried to forget. $400,000. Gone. But I signed papers. Carlos showed me. That's what I need to discuss with you. Fitzgerald opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a manila folder thick enough to choke a bee horse. Your grandfather was particular about documentation. He recorded every family meeting that took place in this office, going back 20 years. He was concerned about disputes after his death, wanted everything on record. He placed an old cassette recorder on the desk between us, the kind that looked like it belonged in a museum. This recording is from March 15th, 6 months before your grandfather's death. Your brother Carlos and sister Elena came to see me about concerns regarding your mental health and your ability to manage finances. My sister Elena, the successful real estate agent who'd always looked at me like I was a charity case, the one who'd hugged me at the funeral and whispered how proud she was that I was finally thinking of others with the donation. They wanted to be named as trustees of your inheritance, claiming you were unfit to handle money due to PTSD and what they called combat-related decision-making impairment. I refused, of course. Your grandfather's instructions were crystal clear. Fitzgerald's finger hovered over the play button. But they didn't give up. This tape captures a conversation that took place 2 weeks after your grandfather's funeral, when they thought I was out of the office. My secretary had stepped away, and they were waiting in the conference room. They didn't know the recording system was still running. The cassette player clicked as he pressed play, and suddenly, the room filled with voices I knew as well as my own heartbeat. Carlos, confident and smooth as always. Elena, sharp and calculating. And a third voice that made my blood run cold, my Aunt Patricia, the family matriarch who'd never liked that Grandpa had chosen me as his primary heir. The signature looks perfect. Elena's voice crackled through the old speakers. Maya's been so out of it since she got back, she won't question anything, especially if we frame it as honoring Grandpa's memory. Carlos chimed in. She signs everything I put in front of her without reading it. 2 tours in Afghanistan really messed her up. She's like a robot now, just going through the motions. And the charity angle is brilliant, Patricia added. Makes us look generous, and Maya gets to feel good about helping others. She'll never know the money went into our accounts instead. My world tilted sideways. The charity. The foundation they'd named after my grandfather. It had all been a lie. I should feel bad, Elena continued. But she's never going to be normal again. That money would just sit in some account while she lives in that tiny apartment, going to therapy 3 times a week. At least this way, the family benefits. Besides, Carlos said, and I could hear him moving papers around. If she ever gets suspicious, who's going to believe her? The decorated war hero who can't sleep without medication and jumps every time a car backfires? We're protecting her. From herself. Fitzgerald stopped the tape. The silence in the office felt thick enough to swim through. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow. But for once, it wasn't because of combat memories. It was rage. Pure and simple. Burning through my veins like rocket fuel. There's more, Fitzgerald said quietly. 23 minutes more. They discuss forging your signature, moving the money through shell companies, and splitting it 3 ways. They even talk about what they'll say if you ever figure it out. I stared at the cassette player like it was an unexploded bomb. How long have you known? I found this tape last week while organizing your grandfather's files. I've been trying to figure out the best way to handle it. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Maya, they've committed multiple felonies. Wire fraud, forgery, theft, conspiracy. This tape is enough to send all 3 of them to federal prison. The room seemed to shrink around me. 3 years of thinking I was broken, 3 years of doubting my own judgment, 3 years of being grateful for my family's support while they systematically stole my future. They'd used my service, my sacrifice, my trauma as a weapon against me. But as I sat there listening to my own heartbeat in my ears, I realized something else. They'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the woman who'd survived 2 combat deployments, who'd learned to stay calm under fire, who'd been trained to think strategically under the worst possible circumstances. The girl they'd known before I enlisted might have crumbled under this betrayal, but the woman sitting in that lawyer's office was someone entirely different. Someone who understood patience, planning, and the importance of choosing your battles. Carefully. Mr. Fitzgerald, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. I need to know everything. Every detail, every transaction, every lie they told. And then I need to know exactly how we're going to make this right. He smiled for the first time since I'd walked into his office. I was hoping you'd say that. The Rodriguez family compound sat on 3 acres of prime Scottsdale real estate. A sprawling adobe mansion that my grandfather had built with his own hands over 40 years. Desert landscaping surrounded the main house, with carefully placed saguaro cacti and flowering palo, verde trees creating an oasis that whispered money and tradition. Every Christmas, Easter, and birthday for the past 25 years had been celebrated here, around the massive dining table that could seat 16 comfortably. As I pulled my beat-up Honda Civic through the wrought iron gates 3 days after, meeting with Fitzgerald, the contrast between my life and theirs had never been more stark. Carlos's brand-new Tesla Model S gleamed in the circular driveway next to Elena's white BMW SUV and Patricia's pearl-colored Cadillac Escalade. My car looked like it belonged in a different zip code entirely, which was probably exactly how they wanted it. The November heat was finally breaking, but the late afternoon sun still blazed across the terracotta tiles and into the floor-to-ceiling, windows that showcased the family's carefully curated success. Through those windows, I could see my relatives moving around like actors in a play I'd never been invited to audition for. They were preparing for what they called a family financial meeting, the same type of gathering where they'd convinced me to sign away my inheritance 6 months ago. Patricia stood at the head of the dining table, her silver hair swept into the kind of perfect chignon that required professional maintenance. At 68, she commanded the Rodriguez family like a 5-star general, her word considered law on everything from marriage partners to career choices. She'd been the one to suggest I join the military instead of going to college, claiming it would build character and discipline in ways that books never could. Now I wondered if she'd simply wanted me far away during the years when family financial decisions were being made. Elena circulated around the table, placing manila folders at each seat with the efficiency of someone who'd built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire by the age of 35. Her black power suit was tailored to perfection, every blonde hair in place, her makeup applied with the precision of a surgeon. She'd always been the beauty of the family, the one who'd married well and invested wisely, the daughter who'd made Patricia proud by choosing profit over sentiment at every opportunity. Carlos dominated the conversation from his position near the wet bar, gesturing with a tumbler of aged whiskey as he explained something about market volatility and charitable tax deductions. At 42, he was the family's golden boy, the son who'd taken over Grandpa's construction business and expanded it into a regional empire. His navy suit probably cost more than I spent on rent in 3 months, and his confidence filled the room like expensive cologne. I sat in my car for another moment, studying them through the glass. These people had raised me, had been my entire world after my parents died. Patricia had taught me to make tamales for Christmas morning. Elena had helped me pick out my prom dress and driven me to the recruiting station when I'd decided to enlist. Carlos had been the one to hold me when I cried after my first breakup, promising that anyone who didn't see my worth wasn't worthy of the Rodriguez name. But watching them now, I saw something different in their movements, something I'd trained myself to recognize during night patrols in hostile territory, the way Elena's eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits and advantages, the way Carlos positioned himself with his back to the wall, maintaining visual control of the space. the way Patricia's hands moved with the calculated precision of someone accustomed to manipulating outcomes. These weren't the loving family members who'd sent care packages to Afghanistan. These were opponents who'd been playing a long game while I was dodging IEDs and learning to sleep through mortar fire. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Where are you? We're ready to start." I typed back a simple, "On my way," gathered the folder Fitzgerald had prepared for me, and stepped out into the desert heat. The walk to the front door felt like the longest 100 yards of my life, longer even than some of the patrols I'd run in Kandahar province. The house smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, the same candles Patricia had burned for as long as I could remember. Family photos lined the hallway leading to the dining room, images spanning 3 generations of Rodriguez success stories. My eyes caught on one particular frame, a picture from my high school graduation where I stood between Carlos and Elena, all of us grinning like we owned the world. The girl in that photo looked so young, so trusting, so completely unaware of what the people flanking her were capable of. "Maya, mija, there you are." Patricia's voice carried the warmth that had comforted me through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks. She crossed the room with her arms extended, pulling me into a hug that smelled like Chanel No. 5 and betrayal. We were starting to worry. You know how Elena gets when people are late. Elena looked up from her papers with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "No worries, we're just going over some final details about the Foundation's quarterly report. The board is so impressed with how the Roberto Rodriguez Memorial Foundation is performing. The foundation, named after my grandfather, funded with my stolen inheritance." I felt my jaw clench, but I'd learned discipline in places these people couldn't even imagine. "That's wonderful. I'm sure Grandpa would be proud." Carlos handed me a glass of wine without being asked, the same Malbec we'd shared at Christmas dinner. He absolutely would be. The foundation has already funded 3 scholarship programs and is looking at expanding into veteran services. Your sacrifice really made this possible, Maya. My sacrifice. The words tasted like copper pennies in my mouth. I took a small sip of wine and nodded, playing the role they expected me to play. The grateful, slightly damaged veteran who was just happy to be included in family decisions. "Let's sit down and go through the numbers," Patricia said, settling into her chair at the head of the table like a queen claiming her throne. "Elena has prepared a comprehensive overview of how the foundation funds are being allocated." The dining table had been my grandfather's pride, hand-carved mesquite wood that he'd finished himself during the long Arizona evenings after work. He'd told me stories about selecting each piece of wood, about the months he'd spent sanding and staining, until the grain pattern emerged like a hidden treasure. Now that table was being used to present fraudulent financial reports about money they'd stolen from his granddaughter. Elena opened her folder with a theatrical flourish, spreading charts and graphs across the polished surface. The initial donation of $437,000 has been strategically invested across several portfolio options. We've seen a 12% return in the first quarter alone. I studied the documents she placed in front of me, numbers and percentages that meant nothing because they represented money that was never theirs to invest. But I played along, nodding at appropriate moments, asking the kinds of questions they expected from someone who'd never been good with financial details. "This is all very impressive," I said, tracing a finger along one of the charts. "But I have to ask, who's actually managing these investments?" The foundation paperwork mentioned a board of trustees. Carlos and Elena exchanged a glance so quick I almost missed it. Almost. "Well, the board consists of family members," Carlos explained, his voice carrying just a hint of defensiveness. "Patricia serves as chairwoman, Elena handles the investment strategy, and I oversee the operational aspects. We felt it was important to keep things within the family, to honor Grandpa's values. And the beneficiaries, you mentioned veteran services." I kept my voice neutral, genuinely curious about how deep their deception ran. Patricia's smile widened. We're still researching the best organizations to support. We want to make sure the money goes to groups that truly understand the challenges our veterans face, organizations that provide real support for PTSD treatment and readjustment services. The irony was so thick I could taste it. They were discussing using my stolen money to help veterans like me, while sitting across from a veteran they'd already victimized. It was like being offered a bandage by the person who'd caused the wound. That sounds perfect, I said, taking another sip of wine. I'm sure you'll find organizations that really understand how to help veterans who've been taken advantage of. The room went quiet for just a moment, and I saw something flicker across Elena's face. Suspicion, maybe, or just surprise that I'd contributed anything meaningful to the conversation. Exactly, she said carefully. Veterans who've been through trauma are particularly vulnerable to financial exploitation. It's unfortunately common. I nodded solemnly. I've heard that. People taking advantage of veterans who might not be thinking clearly due to PTSD or readjustment issues, using their trust against them. It's really despicable. Carlos shifted in his seat, suddenly very interested in his whiskey glass. Yes, well, that's exactly why we wanted to handle this responsibly. Keep everything transparent and above board. Transparency is so important, I agreed, pulling my own folder from my purse and placing it on the table. Speaking of which, I brought some documents I thought you might find interesting. Mr. Fitzgerald gave them to me when I stopped by his office earlier this week. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patricia's wine glass paused, halfway to her lips. Elena's perfectly manicured fingers stopped shuffling papers. Carlos set his tumbler down with slightly more force than necessary. Fitzgerald? Patricia's voice was carefully controlled. Why were you meeting with your grandfather's attorney? I smiled, the same smile I'd perfected during pre-deployment briefings when discussing enemy tactics. Oh, just some routine paperwork. You know how thorough Grandpa was about documentation. Apparently, he kept records of everything. The silence stretched between us like a tripwire, dangerous and waiting for someone to make the wrong move. But I'd learned patience in places where impatience could get you killed. I could wait as long as they needed me to wait. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of tracer fire against an Afghan twilight. But inside the dining room of my childhood, surrounded by people who'd raised me and betrayed me, I felt more at home than I had in months. For the first time since coming back from my deployment, I knew exactly where I stood and exactly what I needed to do. The dismissal started, subtly, the way most betrayals do. Elena was the first to break the silence, her laugh tinkling like broken glass as she waved her manicured hand dismissively. Maya, honey, you don't need to worry about legal paperwork anymore. We've got everything handled. You should focus on getting better. Getting better. The phrase they'd been using like a weapon for 3 years, implying I was broken, damaged, incapable of handling adult responsibilities. Patricia nodded along, her expression the perfect blend of concern and condescension that she'd perfected over decades of managing people she considered beneath her. Mija, we know the transition back to civilian life has been challenging for you, Patricia said, reaching across the table to pat my hand like I was a confused child. All those medications the VA has you on, the therapy sessions 3 times a week. It's a lot for anyone to process. That's why we're here to help. Carlos leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his right to make decisions for other people. The doctors at the VA told us that veterans with PTSD often struggle with complex financial decisions. Something about how trauma affects the parts of the brain responsible for judgment and impulse control. I felt my spine stiffen, but I kept my expression neutral. They'd been talking to my doctors, behind my back, gathering ammunition to use against me. We're not saying you're incompetent, Elena added quickly, though her tone suggested exactly that. We're just saying that maybe financial planning isn't the best use of your energy right now. You should be focusing on healing, on finding your peace. My peace. As if peace was something you could find in a pill bottle or a therapist's office, rather than something you fought for every single day. As if the woman who'd led convoy missions through IED-infested roads wasn't capable of reading a bank statement. The foundation work is honestly a blessing for all of us, Patricia continued, her voice taking on the saccharine quality she used when delivering bad news wrapped in pretty paper. It gives the family a way to honor Roberto's memory while ensuring the money is being used responsibly. No pressure on you, no complicated investment decisions to worry about. Plus, Carlos added, setting his glass down with a soft clink, charity work looks good if you ever decide to apply for government jobs. Veterans' preference points combined with a history of philanthropic involvement? That's a winning combination. They had it all figured out. My entire future mapped out in terms that made their theft sound like guidance, their betrayal like protection. I was supposed to be grateful that they'd relieved me of the burden of my own inheritance. Elena pulled out another set of papers, spreading them across the table with the efficiency of someone presenting evidence in court. These are the psychological evaluations from your intake sessions at the VA. Dr. Morrison noted concerns about your ability to make long-term financial commitments. I stared at the documents, recognizing my own medical records. Private, confidential information that should never have left the VA hospital. How did you get those? Carlos knows people, Patricia said with a dismissive wave. His construction company does a lot of work with government contracts. It's all above board, mija. We just wanted to make sure we understood what you were dealing with. Above board. They'd somehow accessed my private medical records to build a case for my incompetence, and they called it above board. The audacity was breathtaking, but what struck me more was how carefully they'd planned this. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision to steal my money. This was a calculated campaign that had been months, maybe years in the making. Look at this section, Elena said, pointing to a highlighted paragraph with her perfectly painted nail. Dr. Morrison specifically mentions that you have difficulty trusting your own judgment and persistent anxiety about making wrong decisions. Those aren't the characteristics of someone ready to manage a large inheritance. The highlighted text blurred slightly as I read it, not because of tears, but because of rage so pure it made my vision tunnel. They'd taken my honest admissions about struggling with hypervigilance and decision fatigue, symptoms that were normal, parts of readjustment, and weaponized them against me. Maya doesn't even drive anymore, Carlos added, as if this proved some fundamental point about my incompetence. She takes the bus everywhere because she's afraid of being behind the wheel. How is someone who's afraid to drive supposed to make investment decisions? The driving. Another piece of my trauma they'd cataloged and filed away for future use. I'd stopped driving after a panic attack triggered by a backfiring motorcycle that sounded too much like gunfire. It was temporary, a precaution while I worked through hypervigilance issues with my therapist, but they'd turned it into evidence of permanent disability. And the nightmares, Patricia added softly, her voice heavy with false sympathy. Elena told me you still wake up screaming some nights. The neighbors in your apartment complex have complained. Elena nodded gravely. Mrs. Chen from next door called me last month. She was worried about you. Said it sounds like you're reliving battles in your sleep. They'd been monitoring me. My neighbors, my doctors. Probably my therapist too if they could manage it. Building a comprehensive file of my weaknesses while presenting themselves as concerned family members just looking out for my best interests. The point is, Carlos said, leaning forward with the expression of someone delivering an uncomfortable truth. We love you, Maya. But love means being honest about limitations. And right now, your limitations include the ability to handle complex financial responsibilities. Which is why the foundation is perfect, Elena chimed in. All the benefits of honoring Grandpa's memory, none of the stress of managing investments or making distribution decisions. You get to feel good about helping people without having to worry about the details. I took a slow sip of wine, using the time to study their faces. 3 people who'd raised me, who'd sung me lullabies and taught me to ride a bike and cheered at my high school graduation. 3 people who were now sitting across from me, explaining why stealing my inheritance was actually an act of love. The psychology was almost elegant in its cruelty. They'd identified every vulnerability I'd ever shared with them, every moment of weakness or uncertainty, and built a fortress of justification around their theft. I wasn't being robbed. I was being protected from my own incompetence. Besides, Patricia added, refilling her wine glass with steady hands, it's not like you were planning to do anything significant with the money anyway. You live in a tiny apartment, drive an old car when you drive at all, spend most of your time at the VA hospital or therapy appointments. What would you even do with $400,000? The question hung in the air like a challenge. What would the broken veteran do with real money? What dreams could someone with PTSD and trust issues possibly have that would justify disrupting their carefully orchestrated charity scam? I could go back to school, I said quietly. Finish my degree, maybe law school, like I'd planned before I enlisted. Carlos actually laughed. Maya, you can barely handle grocery shopping without having anxiety attacks. Law school is 3 years of high-stress competition with people who've been preparing their whole lives. Be realistic. Or I could start a business, I continued, keeping my voice steady. Something to help other veterans transition back to civilian life. With what qualifications? Elena asked, not unkindly, but with the patronizing tone of someone explaining basic math to a child. Starting a business requires networking, marketing, financial planning, risk assessment, all things that require the kind of clear thinking that you're still working to recover. Patricia nodded along. And the failure rate for new businesses is astronomical even for people without challenges. We'd hate to see you lose everything because you weren't ready for that kind of responsibility. Every suggestion I made was met with calm, logical reasons why it wouldn't work. Not because they were trying to be mean, they assured me, but because they cared too much to let me set myself up for failure. It was gaslighting wrapped in concern, manipulation disguised as protection. The truth is, Carlos said, finishing his whiskey and setting the glass down with finality, Grandpa probably would have wanted the money to go to charity anyway. He was always talking about giving back to the community, helping people who were less fortunate. And you're already doing that, Elena added brightly. Through the foundation, you're helping scholarship students and veteran services organizations. You're making a difference in the world. More of a difference than you could make by keeping the money for yourself, Patricia concluded. Generosity is healing, mija. It's good for the soul. They'd managed to turn my inheritance into their gift to me. Stealing my money had become an act of therapeutic intervention, a way to help me heal from trauma by removing the burden of financial responsibility. They were heroes in their own story, and I was the grateful beneficiary of their wisdom and compassion. I looked around the table at these 3 people who'd spent months, maybe years, planning my financial destruction while convincing themselves they were saving me from my own damaged judgment. The woman who'd survived firefights and roadside bombs was apparently too fragile to handle a trust fund. But as I sat there, listening to them explain why robbing me was really an act of love, I felt something I hadn't experienced since coming home from Afghanistan. Clarity. Pure, crystal-clear understanding of exactly who I was dealing with and exactly what needed to be done. They thought they were protecting a broken veteran from her own poor judgment. What they'd actually done was underestimate a soldier who'd learned to think strategically under the worst possible circumstances. The folder Fitzgerald had given me sat unopened on the table between us, 20 years of recorded conversations that would demolish their carefully constructed narrative in a matter of minutes. But I wasn't ready to deploy that weapon yet. Sometimes the most effective strategy was letting your enemies continue believing they'd already won. The wine glass felt heavier in my hand than it should have, but I managed to keep my grip steady. as their words washed over me like artillery fire I'd learned to endure. My chest burned with the kind of controlled fury that had kept me alive during night patrols, but my face remained a mask of polite confusion. 3 years of therapy had taught me to recognize my triggers, but military training had taught me something far more valuable: how to weaponize composure. "You're absolutely right," I said softly, setting down my glass with deliberate care. "I haven't been thinking clearly since I got back. The medication makes everything feel foggy." I watched Patricia's shoulders relax slightly, saw Elena's smile become more genuine. They wanted me compliant, grateful, damaged enough to need their protection, but functional enough to sign whatever papers they put in front of me. I could give them exactly what they expected. "The nightmares have been getting worse lately," I continued, rubbing my temples like someone fighting a headache. "Dr. Morrison says it's normal, part of the adjustment process, but some mornings, I can't even remember what day it is." Carlos leaned forward, his expression shifting to something that might have been genuine concern if I hadn't heard him laughing about my condition on Fitzgerald's tape. "Have they adjusted your medications recently? Sometimes that can make things worse before they get better." "Last month. New dosage of the sleep medication plus something for anxiety." I let my voice trail off slightly, playing the role of someone overwhelmed by pharmaceutical complexity. "I've been having trouble concentrating. Simple things feel impossible some days." The lies came easily because they were built on fragments of truth. I had struggled with sleep medication side effects. I did have days when concentration felt like swimming through mud. But those challenges didn't make me incompetent, and they certainly didn't justify what my family had done. They just made me human, a veteran processing trauma in a world that didn't understand the weight of what I'd carried home. "That's exactly why we wanted to handle the foundation responsibilities," Elena said, her voice warm with what sounded like relief. "You shouldn't have to worry about investment portfolios and tax implications when you're dealing with all of this." I nodded slowly, as if processing her words through a medication haze. "It does seem complicated, all those numbers and percentages." I gestured vaguely at the charts spread across the table. "I tried to read through the documents you sent last month, but halfway through I got confused and had to lie down." Patricia reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her rings pressing cold against my skin. "Mija, there's no shame in admitting when something is too much. We're family. We take care of each other." Family. The word tasted like ashes in my mouth, but I managed to smile gratefully. These people had taken care of me in their way. They'd taken care of my money right into their own accounts while convincing themselves they were protecting me from financial stress. "I keep thinking about what Grandpa would want," I said, letting a slight tremor enter my voice. "He worked so hard for that money. Double shifts at the mine, weekends doing construction work. I don't want to mess up his legacy because I can't think straight." Carlos's expression softened in a way that might have fooled me if I hadn't known what I knew. "Grandpa would want you to focus on getting well. He'd want the money to do good in the world, which is exactly what's happening through the foundation. And he'd want you to have support," Elena added. "He used to worry about what would happen to you if you came back from deployment with injuries. Not just physical ones, but the invisible wounds that are harder to treat. Invisible wounds. They'd turned my trauma into their justification, my service into evidence of my incompetence. The grandfather who'd raised me to be strong and independent had apparently worried I'd come home too broken to function. At least according to the people who'd forged my signature and stolen my inheritance. Dr. Morrison says the trust issues are the hardest part," I said, picking at the edge of my napkin like someone trying to hold on to reality. "He says trauma makes it difficult to know who to trust, that my judgment about people might be compromised for a while." The irony was exquisite. My therapist had indeed discussed trust issues, but in the context of learning to trust myself again, not because I was incapable of recognizing manipulation. The same people who'd spent months gaslighting me were now using my struggle to rebuild. confidence as proof that I couldn't handle my own affairs. That's why family is so important, Patricia said, her voice heavy with false sincerity. We knew you before the war. We remember who you were, and we can help you find your way back to that person. But I wasn't the same person who'd left for basic training 8 years ago. That 18-year-old girl had been naive enough to trust, without question, to sign papers without reading them, to believe that love and loyalty were the same thing. The woman sitting at this table had learned the difference between protection and control, between concern and manipulation. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed in the army, I said, staring down at my hands like someone lost in painful memories. At least there, everything was clear. Orders were orders. Here, everything feels complicated. Carlos shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The military lifestyle isn't sustainable long-term, Maya. All that structure and rigidity, it's not healthy for personal development. Personal development. Coming from a man who'd just spent 20 minutes explaining why I was too damaged to manage money, the phrase was almost funny. But I kept my expression neutral, playing the role of someone too medicated and confused to recognize the contradictions in their logic. The important thing is that you're here now, Elena said, reaching for my other hand in a gesture that would have looked loving to any outside observer. You're safe, you're getting treatment, and you don't have to worry about financial stress. On top of everything else, safe. I was safe from the burden of my own inheritance, protected from the terrible responsibility of deciding how to spend money my grandfather had earned with his blood and sweat. They'd created a cage made of concern and called it freedom. I brought some documents from Mr. Fitzgerald, I said hesitantly, touching the folder I'd placed on the table earlier. He said there were some things I should review, but honestly, I'm not sure I understand them. The temperature in the room dropped another degree. Elena's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on mine. Carlos reached for his whiskey glass even though it was empty. What kind of documents? Patricia asked, her voice carefully neutral. I opened the folder with fumbling fingers, playing up the medication side effects I'd mentioned earlier. Some old paperwork from when the trust was set up. And something about recordings? I didn't really understand that part. The silence stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats before Carlos cleared his throat. Recordings of what? I'm not sure, I said, pulling out a single sheet of paper and squinting at it like someone struggling to focus. Something about family meetings in his office? Mr. Fitzgerald mentioned that Grandpa liked to document important conversations. Elena and Carlos exchanged a look that lasted a fraction of a second too long. Patricia's wine glass paused halfway, to her lips before she set it down with exaggerated care. Your grandfather was very thorough about record-keeping, Patricia said slowly. It was part of his business training. He documented everything. I nodded like someone processing information through a pharmaceutical fog. Mr. Fitzgerald said he had boxes of old files to go through. 20 years of paperwork and recordings. He seemed to think some of it might be relevant to the trust administration. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Not quite threatening, but impossible to ignore. I watched their faces carefully, noting the micro-expressions they probably didn't realize they were displaying. Elena's left eye twitched slightly. Carlos's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Patricia's fingers drummed once against the table before she forced them still. Did he say when he might finish reviewing everything? Elena asked, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal. A few more weeks, I think. He mentioned wanting to be thorough since it's such a large estate. I closed the folder and pushed it aside like someone too overwhelmed to deal with complex paperwork. Honestly, I hope it doesn't drag on too long. All this legal stuff makes my head hurt. Carlos stood abruptly, moving toward the bar with slightly more energy than the situation required. Anyone need a refill? Maya, maybe some water instead of wine? Alcohol and medication don't always mix well. Always looking out for my health, my brother was. concerned about drug interactions while he counted money he'd stolen from my trust fund. I accepted the water gratefully, playing the role of someone who needed constant guidance about basic self-care. "You know what might help?" Patricia said, her voice taking on the bright tone she used when she'd reached a decision. "Maybe we should schedule a meeting with Mr. Fitzgerald ourselves. As your family, we could help explain the foundation structure and make sure he understands how well everything is working." Elena nodded enthusiastically. "That's a wonderful idea. Sometimes lawyers get caught up in technical details and miss the bigger picture. We could provide context about your current situation and treatment needs." They wanted to control the narrative before Fitzgerald could reveal anything that might contradict their carefully constructed story, but their eagerness to insert themselves into my legal affairs was exactly the kind of overreach that would look suspicious to anyone paying attention. "That might be helpful," I said, allowing relief to color my voice. I get so confused trying to explain everything myself. You're all much better with complicated financial stuff. The validation seemed to relax them slightly. Patricia smiled with what looked like genuine warmth, and Carlos returned to his seat with his shoulders less rigid than they'd been moments before. But behind my mask of grateful confusion, my mind was cataloging every word, every expression, every tell that revealed their growing anxiety about Fitzgerald's involvement. They thought they were managing a damaged veteran too medicated to think clearly. What they were actually doing was confessing their guilt to a soldier who'd learned to gather intelligence under far more challenging circumstances than a family dinner in Scottsdale. The folder sat closed on the table between us, but its presence had already accomplished its purpose. They knew I'd been to see Fitzgerald. They knew he was reviewing old files and recordings. And they knew their window for controlling this situation was rapidly closing. Now, all I had to do was wait and watch them make the mistakes that desperate people always make when they think they're smarter than everyone else in the room. The memory hit me like shrapnel while Elena was explaining tax implications for the third time. I was 19, fresh out of basic training, sitting in this same dining room during my first leave home. The mesquite table had been covered with deployment paperwork then, forms that needed signatures and emergency contacts and beneficiary information. Patricia had insisted on helping me fill everything out, claiming the military bureaucracy was too complicated for someone my age to navigate alone. "You don't understand how these things work, Mija," she'd said, her pen hovering over the life insurance forms. "What if something happens to you over there? We need to make sure everything is handled properly." I'd been so grateful for their help, so touched that they cared enough to spend hours walking me through documents I barely understood. Carlos had even driven me to the base legal office to get everything notarized, waiting in the parking lot for 2 hours while I signed my life away in neat, orderly boxes. Now I realized they'd been practicing, learning my signature, studying my handwriting, figuring out exactly how much help I'd accept before questioning their involvement. 8 years of preparation for the moment when they'd need to forge my name on documents transferring my inheritance into their control. "Maya." Elena's voice cut through the memory like a blade. "You're looking a little pale. Are you feeling all right?" I blinked back to the present, noting the concerned expressions around the table. How long had I been staring into space? "Sorry, I just remembered something. From when I was getting ready for my first deployment." Patricia leaned forward slightly. "What kind of memory?" "The paperwork, all those forms you helped me fill out." I rubbed my forehead like someone fighting a medication headache. "I was thinking about how patient you all were, walking me through everything step by step." Carlos's laugh sounded forced. "You were barely 19. Most teenagers can't even balance a checkbook, let alone navigate military bureaucracy. You've always been good at taking care of the details I couldn't handle," I said, letting gratitude warm my voice. "Like with the trust fund paperwork. I probably would have messed something up if you hadn't helped." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the quiet of predators realizing their prey might not be as oblivious as they'd assumed. Elena's fingers drummed against her wine glass in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the jazz music playing softly in the background. Speaking of the trust paperwork, Patricia said carefully, when exactly did you sign those donation forms? I'm trying to remember the timeline. The question was a test, I realized. They wanted to see how much I remembered about the day they'd stolen my inheritance. Whether my supposed medication fog extended to that crucial afternoon 6 months ago, it was right after the funeral, I said slowly, as if struggling to piece together fragmented memories. You said Grandpa had left specific instructions about charitable giving. I remember being upset about losing him, not really focused on the details. Carlos nodded encouragingly. You were in no condition to make major decisions. We were worried about you. The grief was overwhelming, I continued, playing the role of someone reconstructing a traumatic period. Plus the new medications Dr. Morrison had prescribed. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life. Elena's shoulders relaxed slightly. That's exactly why we felt comfortable handling the paperwork. You trusted us to follow Grandpa's wishes, and we didn't want to burden you with complex financial decisions while you were mourning. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel Trust. There was that word again, wielded like a weapon disguised as comfort. They'd used my grief and medication side effects to justify theft, then reframed their crime as an act of family loyalty. Do you remember signing something? I said, touching my temple like someone trying to focus through mental fog. But I can't recall the specifics. Was it at Mr. Fitzgerald's office? The question landed like a mortar round in the middle of their carefully constructed narrative. Carlos reached for his empty whiskey glass, realized it was empty, and set it. Down harder than necessary, Patricia's fingers went still against her wine stem. No, mija, Patricia said carefully. We handled everything here at the house. Mr. Fitzgerald wasn't involved in the donation paperwork. Interesting. They'd just confirmed that the signature forgery hadn't taken place in a lawyer's office, where security cameras and witnesses might have complicated their crime. They'd done it here, in the safety of the family compound, where they controlled every variable. That's right, I said, nodding as if pieces were falling into place. We were sitting right here, at this table. You explained about the tax benefits and the Memorial Foundation. Elena smiled with what looked like relief. You seemed to understand everything perfectly. You said it was what Grandpa would have wanted. And you were so grateful, Carlos added. You said it felt good to know the money would help other people, instead of just sitting in an account. They were rewriting history in real time, crafting a version of events where I'd been a willing participant in my own financial destruction. In their story, I'd eagerly donated my inheritance to charity, grateful for their guidance and wisdom. I do remember feeling relieved, I said softly, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Exactly, Patricia beamed. You said you didn't want the responsibility of managing such a large sum, that it felt like too much pressure on top of everything else you were dealing with. The lies flowed so smoothly I almost admired their skill. They'd created a complete alternate reality where I'd been an enthusiastic participant in donating my own money, where my family had simply facilitated my generous impulses rather than manipulating my trauma for their own benefit. But now Mr. Fitzgerald is asking questions about the paperwork, I said, letting worry creep into my voice. He seems confused about some of the details. The room went quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic beyond the compound walls. Elena's hand tightened around her wine glass until her knuckles went white. What kind of questions? Carlos asked, his voice carefully neutral. About signatures and documentation. He mentioned wanting to verify everything was handled properly. I picked at the edge of my napkin like someone struggling with anxiety. He seemed surprised that the donation had been processed so quickly after Grandpa's death. Patricia's laugh sounded brittle. Lawyers always worry about timelines and procedures. It's their job to be cautious. Plus, Mr. Fitzgerald is getting old, Elena added quickly. He probably just doesn't remember all the conversations from last year. Sometimes older attorneys get confused about details. They were already laying groundwork to discredit Fitzgerald if he became a problem, paint him as elderly and forgetful, someone whose memory couldn't be trusted. But they didn't know about the recordings, didn't realize that Fitzgerald had their own voices documenting their crimes in excruciating detail. He did seem very thorough, I said thoughtfully. Asked a lot of questions about my mental state at the time, whether I was capable of making informed decisions. Carlos leaned forward, his expression shifting to something that might have been genuine concern if I hadn't known better. What did you tell him? The truth. That I was grieving and medicated and probably not thinking clearly. I met his eyes directly, watching for his reaction. I told him I was grateful to have family who could handle the complicated stuff while I focused on getting better. The relief that crossed his face was almost comical. He thought I'd just provided testimony that would support their version of events, evidence that I'd been incapable of making rational decisions about my own inheritance. That's perfect, Elena said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Mr. Fitzgerald needs to understand the context. You were dealing with grief, trauma, medication side effects. We were just trying to protect you from additional stress. Protection. Everything they'd done was protection, in their version of reality. Stealing was protection. Forgery was protection. Gaslighting was protection. They'd turned theft into an act of love so thoroughly that they probably believed it themselves. I'm worried he might think I was taken advantage of, I said, allowing vulnerability to color my voice. That maybe I wasn't competent to make financial decisions. Patricia shook her head firmly. Mija, you made the decision to donate that money. Yourself. We just helped with the paperwork. There's a big difference between being overwhelmed and being incompetent. Besides, Carlos added, you're much better now than you were 6 months ago. Your thinking is clearer. You're more stable. Anyone can see the improvement. The irony was breathtaking. They were simultaneously arguing that I'd been mentally competent enough to legally donate my inheritance while claiming I was still too damaged to manage my own financial affairs. The contradictions in their logic would have been obvious to anyone paying attention, but they were so invested in their narrative that they couldn't see the holes in their own story. Maybe I should write a letter to Mr. Fitzgerald, I suggested, watching their faces carefully. Explaining that the donation was my idea, that I'm grateful for your help with the details. Elena's eyes lit up. That's a wonderful idea. It would clear up any confusion about your intentions. We could help you draft it, Carlos offered. Make sure it covers all the important points. Of course they wanted to help. They probably planned to write the entire letter themselves, then have me sign it like every other document they'd forged in my name. Another piece of evidence to support their carefully constructed lie. That would be so helpful, I said gratefully. I'm still not great with formal writing. Military reports are different from legal correspondence. Patricia smiled warmly. We'll make sure it strikes the right tone. Professional but personal, clear about your motivations. They were so eager to control every aspect of this situation that they couldn't see they were walking into a trap. Every offer to help, every suggestion to manage my affairs, every attempt to insert themselves between me and Fitzgerald was just more evidence of their guilt. I feel so much better knowing you're all looking out for me, I said, letting relief flood my voice. Sometimes I worry about what would happen if I didn't have family to help navigate all this complicated stuff. Carlos reached across the table and patted my shoulder with what looked like genuine affection. That's what family is for, Maya. We take care of each other. Take care of each other. Unless taking care meant stealing $400,000 and gaslighting the victim into believing it was an act of love. But I smiled gratefully, playing the role of the damaged veteran who needed constant protection from her own poor judgment. The folder from Fitzgerald sat closed on the table between us, but its presence had already accomplished what I'd hoped. They were scared, scrambling to control a narrative that was rapidly spinning beyond their ability to manage, and in their desperation to maintain their lie, they were making mistakes that would ultimately destroy them. But I wasn't ready to spring the trap yet. Let them think they were managing a confused veteran too medicated to see through their manipulation. Let them believe their carefully crafted story would hold up under scrutiny. Because when that 20-year-old tape finally played, when their own voices filled a courtroom describing exactly how they'd forged my signature and stolen my inheritance, all their concern and protection and family loyalty would be revealed for what it really was. A conspiracy that had been 20 years in the making and 20 minutes away from completely falling apart. The shift started small, almost imperceptible. Elena's phone buzzed during dessert, and when she glanced at the screen, something flickered across her face. Not quite panic, but close enough to make my pulse quicken. She excused herself to take the call in the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile with slightly more urgency than the situation seemed to warrant. "Probably a client emergency," Carlos said, but his eyes followed her movement with the kind of attention that suggested he knew exactly why she was stepping away from the table. Patricia continued talking about the foundation's upcoming fundraising gala, but I noticed her hands had developed a slight tremor as she reached for her wine glass. The same tremor I'd seen in combat veterans trying to appear calm while incoming mortars shook the ground beneath their feet. Through the kitchen archway, I could see Elena pacing, her voice too low to make out words but high enough to convey stress. When she returned to the dining room 5 minutes later, her smile was too bright, her movements too controlled. "Everything all right?" I asked with the innocent concern of someone who hadn't spent 8 years learning to read body language under life-or-death circumstances. "Just a demanding client," Elena said, settling back into her chair with careful precision. "You know how real estate can be. Everyone thinks their house should sell in a week for twice what it's worth." But Carlos was watching her face, and I caught the silent communication that passed between them. A barely perceptible shake of her head, a tightening around his eyes that suggested the phone call hadn't been about real estate at all. "I should probably head home soon," I said, glancing at my watch. "Dr. Morrison says I need to maintain a regular sleep schedule. The medication works better when I'm consistent about timing." "Of course, mija," Patricia said, but there was something forced about her agreement. "We don't want to interfere with your treatment routine." Elena's phone buzzed again. This time she silenced it without looking, but not before I caught the name on the screen. Fitzgerald, Jonathan. My heart rate spiked, but I kept my expression neutral. The lawyer was calling Elena directly, which meant something had changed since our meeting 3 days ago. "Actually," Carlos said, standing abruptly, "maybe we should all take a break. It's been a long evening, and Maya looks tired." I did look tired, but not for the reasons he assumed. The constant performance of playing damaged and confused was exhausting in ways that combat patrols had never been. At least in Afghanistan, the enemy had worn different uniforms. "Before you go," Elena said, her voice carrying a note I couldn't quite identify, "there's one more thing we should discuss, about Mr. Fitzgerald." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Patricia set down her wine glass with exaggerated care, and Carlos moved closer to the table like someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "What about him?" I asked, injecting just enough anxiety into my voice to maintain my cover. "He called this afternoon," Elena said slowly. "He seems to have some concerns about the trust administration." My chest tightened, but not with fear, with anticipation. Fitzgerald was making his move, and my family was about to reveal just how guilty they really were. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, playing the role of someone worried about legal complications she couldn't understand. Carlos cleared his throat. "Nothing serious, just some procedural questions about the timeline and documentation. Lawyers always worry about crossing every T and dotting every I." But he specifically asked about your mental state at the time of the donation, Elena added, watching my face carefully. Whether you had proper legal representation, whether anyone else was present during the signing. They were fishing, trying to figure out how much Fitzgerald knew and what he'd told me during our meeting. But they were also revealing their own knowledge of details they shouldn't have known if the donation had been legitimate. I don't remember having a lawyer present, I said uncertainly. Should I have had one? Not necessarily, Patricia said, quickly. For straightforward charitable donations, legal representation isn't always required, especially when family members are helping with the paperwork. Elena's phone buzzed a third time. She glanced at it, frowned, and this time stepped away to answer. Mr. Fitzgerald? Yes, I can talk now. The conversation was brief, but I could hear the tension in Elena's voice even from across the room when she returned. Her face was pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. He wants to meet with all of us, she said quietly. Tomorrow afternoon. He says he has some documents he'd like us to review. Documents. The word hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Carlos's hand tightened around his whiskey glass, and Patricia's breathing became slightly more shallow. What kind of documents? I asked, letting worry creep into my voice. He didn't specify, Elena said, but her eyes kept darting toward Carlos, like someone seeking reassurance she wasn't going to receive. This is probably just routine, Carlos said, but his voice lacked conviction. Estate attorneys have to be thorough, especially with larger inheritances. They document everything, including 20 years of recorded conversations that would demolish their carefully constructed lies in a matter of minutes. But they didn't know that yet, which meant I had a front row seat to watch them panic in real time. Maybe I should call him, I suggested. Find out what this is about before we all meet. No, Elena said quickly, then caught herself. I mean, there's no need to bother him tonight. We can handle whatever questions he has tomorrow. But her phone was buzzing again. And this time when she looked at the screen, her face went completely white. She stood without a word and walked toward the kitchen, but not before I caught a glimpse of the caller ID. Fitzgerald, Jonathan, urgent. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia and Carlos sat frozen in their chairs like deer caught in headlights, neither of them willing to acknowledge the obvious fact that something had gone very wrong with their carefully orchestrated cover-up. Should we be worried? I asked, allowing genuine anxiety to color my voice. About the meeting tomorrow? There's nothing to worry about, Carlos said, but he was watching the kitchen doorway like someone expecting bad news. We followed all the proper procedures. Everything was documented correctly. Through the archway, I could see Elena pacing again, but this time her movements were sharper, more agitated. Her voice carried just enough for me to catch fragments. Can't be right. And double-check the files. And finally, clear as a gunshot. The recordings? Carlos went rigid in his chair. Patricia's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor, dark red liquid spreading across the white tiles like a crime scene. Recordings? Patricia whispered, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she looked everyone of her 68 years. Elena returned from the kitchen, moving like someone walking through a minefield. Her face was ashen, her hands shaking as she reached for her purse. We need to leave, she said quietly. Now. What's wrong? I asked, standing with the careful movements of someone whose medication made sudden motion difficult. What did Mr. Fitzgerald say? Elena looked at Carlos, then at Patricia, then back at me. For a moment, I thought she might tell the truth. Confess everything and beg for forgiveness and mercy. Instead, she did what guilty people always do when cornered. She lied. He found some irregularities in the paperwork, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Nothing serious, but he wants to review everything with fresh eyes. Make sure all the procedures were followed correctly. Irregularities. The same word that government investigators used when they were being polite about crimes they hadn't quite finished documenting. But Elena's definition of irregularities was about to collide with the reality of 20-year-old recordings that captured every detail of their conspiracy. "Should I be worried about the donation?" I asked, playing my role to perfection. "Could there be problems with the tax implications?" "No," Carlos said firmly, but his voice cracked slightly on the word. "Everything was handled properly. We made sure of that." But as he spoke, I watched him glance toward the kitchen where Elena's phone continued to buzz with increasingly urgent calls from Fitzgerald. Whatever the lawyer had discovered in those old files, it was enough to make my brother sweat through. His expensive suit. "Maybe we should postpone the meeting," Patricia suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Give Mr. Fitzgerald more time to review everything thoroughly." "We can't postpone," Elena said sharply. "He was very clear about wanting to see all of us tomorrow. All of us." The emphasis on those last words carried weight that went beyond simple scheduling concerns. Fitzgerald wasn't just requesting a meeting. He was summoning them, and they all knew it. "I'm sure everything will be fine," I said, gathering my purse with the slow, deliberate movements of someone whose medication made coordination challenging. "You've all been so careful about handling everything properly." Elena's laugh sounded like breaking glass. "Yes, we've been very careful." But as I walked toward the front door, I could feel their eyes on my back, could sense the panic they were working so hard to conceal. They thought they were watching a confused veteran stumble through legal complications she couldn't understand. What they were actually seeing was a soldier executing a perfectly planned tactical withdrawal, leaving her enemies to contemplate the scope of their exposure while she prepared for the final phase of an operation they didn't even know had begun. The drive home gave me time to process what I'd witnessed. Elena's phone calls from Fitzgerald weren't random legal inquiries. They were the opening moves in a chess game that had been 20 years in the making. The lawyer had found something in those old files, something that connected directly to the recordings he'd played for me. By tomorrow afternoon, when we all sat down in his office, the charade would be over. The carefully constructed narrative about my grateful donation to charity would collapse under the weight of evidence that couldn't be explained away or reframed as family protection. But tonight, for a few more hours, my family could continue, believing they'd successfully stolen my inheritance and convinced me to be grateful for their theft. Tomorrow, they'd learn the difference between managing a damaged veteran and underestimating a soldier who'd spent 3 years preparing for exactly this kind of operation. The recording that would destroy them had been waiting in Fitzgerald's files for 20 years, patient as a landmine buried in familiar ground. And like every effective weapon, it would do the most damage when the enemy least expected it. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, jarring me awake from the first decent night's sleep I'd had in months. Elena's voice carried through the phone with the brittle intensity of someone who'd been awake all night. "Maya, we need to talk before the meeting with Fitzgerald. Can you come to the house early?" I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. In the military, emergency calls before dawn usually meant someone was dead or about to be. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said quickly, but her voice pitched higher on the denial. "We just want to make sure we're all on the same page before we see the lawyer. Family solidarity, you know? Family solidarity." The same phrase they'd used when convincing me to sign papers I hadn't read, when explaining why they needed access to my medical records, when justifying every violation of my trust and privacy. Now they wanted solidarity as their carefully constructed lies began crumbling around them. "Of course," I said, injecting the appropriate amount of sleepy confusion into my voice. "What time should I be there?" 9 o'clock. We'll have coffee and pastries, go over everything before the appointment." After I hung up, I sat in the pre-dawn darkness of my apartment, listening to the familiar sounds of the city waking up. Distant. Traffic, the hum of air conditioners, the occasional siren racing toward someone else's emergency. 3 years ago, those sounds had triggered hypervigilance responses that left me exhausted and jumpy. Now they felt like a soundtrack to clarity. They were panicking. Elena's call confirmed what I'd suspected after watching their behavior the night before. Fitzgerald had found something in those old files, something that connected directly to their theft of my inheritance. Now they needed to coordinate their stories, make sure everyone was prepared to maintain the same lies when confronted with evidence. But they were operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of the tactical situation. They thought they were dealing with a damaged veteran who needed protection from complex legal matters. What they were actually facing was a soldier who'd spent 3 years planning for exactly this moment. I arrived at the compound at exactly 9 o'clock, parking my Honda Civic next to Carlos's Tesla, with the precision of someone who'd learned that timing could be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The morning air carried the scent of desert sage and automotive exhaust, Arizona's unique perfume of nature and progress locked in eternal competition. Patricia answered the door wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, but her usual composure showed cracks around the edges. Her smile was too bright, her movements too quick, like someone operating on caffeine and anxiety rather than confidence. "Mia, thank you for coming early. We thought it would be good to discuss the meeting before we see Mr. Fitzgerald." The dining room had been transformed into a war room. Legal pads covered the mesquite table, along with copies of documents I recognized as forged trust paperwork. Elena sat at the head of the table with her laptop open, typing with the focused intensity of someone researching damage control strategies. Carlos paced near the windows, cell phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in low, urgent tones to someone who was clearly not returning the reassurance he was seeking. When he saw me enter, he ended the call abruptly and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maya. Perfect. Timing. We were just reviewing the foundation paperwork to make sure we can answer any questions Fitzgerald might have." Elena looked up from her laptop screen, and I was shocked by the change in her appearance. The polished real estate executive from the night before had been replaced by someone who looked like she'd been interrogated by hostile forces. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. That suggested she'd been running her hands through it all night. "We need to talk about what you might have said to Fitzgerald during your meeting," she said without preamble. "He's asking very specific questions about the timeline and procedures." I settled into my chair with the careful movements of someone whose medication made sudden motion challenging. I told him the truth, that I was grieving and medicated and grateful to have family handle the complicated stuff. Carlos stopped pacing and turned toward me with relief evident on his face. "That's perfect. That's exactly what he needs to understand. You were in no condition to handle complex financial decisions." "But did you mention anything about recordings?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "About your grandfather documenting conversations?" The question hung in the air like cordite after an explosion. They knew. Somehow, through Elena's conversations with Fitzgerald or their own investigation, they'd learned about the 20 years of recorded meetings. Now they needed to assess how much damage that knowledge could cause. "He mentioned that Grandpa liked to keep records," I said slowly, as if trying to recall details through a medication fog. "Something about documenting important conversations. But I didn't really understand what that meant." Elena's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief. "Lawyers always make everything sound more complicated than it is. Your grandfather was just thorough about business records." "The important thing," Carlos said, moving closer to the table, "is that we all stick to the same story. You wanted to donate the money to charity. We helped with the paperwork. Everything was your decision. Your decision. They were trying to transfer ownership of their crime to me, making me complicit in my own victimization. If questioned under oath, they could claim I'd orchestrated the entire donation, with them serving as innocent facilitators of my charitable impulses." I remember wanting to honor Grandpa's memory, I said carefully. But honestly, a lot of that time is still fuzzy. The grief, the medication changes, everything felt surreal. That's understandable, Patricia said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. But if Fitzgerald asks direct questions about your intentions, you need to be clear that the donation was your idea. Elena's laptop chimed with an incoming email. She glanced at the screen, and the color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. "What is it?" Carlos demanded. Elena turned the screen toward us. The email was from Fitzgerald's office, marked Urgent, Confidential. The subject line read, Rodriguez Trust. Additional documentation required. Carlos read over Elena's shoulder, his face growing darker with each line. He wants copies of all communications related to the trust administration, emails, text, messages, phone records. And he's requesting a forensic handwriting analysis of the donation paperwork, Elena added, her voice barely above a whisper. Forensic analysis. The words hit the room like incoming artillery. They'd forged my signature so carefully, practiced it so many times, that they'd probably convinced themselves it was undetectable. But modern forensic techniques could identify microscopic inconsistencies in pen pressure, stroke patterns, and muscle memory that no amount of practice could perfectly replicate. "This is just standard legal procedure," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Lawyers have to be thorough with large estates." Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and went even paler. "He moved up the meeting. He wants to see us in an hour." Carlos stopped pacing entirely. "An hour? Why the rush?" "He says new information has come to light that requires immediate attention." New information. The recordings that had been waiting. In Fitzgerald's files for 20 years, patient as buried ordnance, ready to detonate when the right conditions aligned. My family had just learned that their carefully timed theft was about to be exposed by evidence they'd never known existed. "Maybe we should postpone," Patricia suggested desperately. "Tell him we need more time to gather the requested documents." "Can't postpone," Elena said flatly. "He was very clear. If we don't show up, he'll proceed without us. Proceed without them, which meant filing criminal charges, freezing assets, alerting federal authorities to wire fraud and conspiracy. Fitzgerald was giving them one last chance to face the evidence before he moved to the next phase of legal action. "We stick to the story," Carlos said, his voice carrying the forced authority of someone trying to maintain command of a situation spiraling beyond his control. "Maya wanted to donate the money. We helped with the paperwork. Everything was legitimate. But as I looked around the table at these three people who'd raised me and betrayed me, I could see the fear in their eyes. They were about to walk into Fitzgerald's office and discover that their 20-year-old conversation about forging my signature had been recorded in perfect, incriminating detail. The trap they'd walked into had been set by my grandfather's paranoia about family disputes. But it was about to be sprung by a soldier they'd systematically underestimated for 3 years. In less than an hour, the lies would stop. The manipulation would end. And my family would finally understand the difference between managing a damaged veteran and confronting a woman who'd learned to fight battles they couldn't even imagine. The law office felt different this time, where 3 days ago it had been a sanctuary of leather-bound books and quiet revelations. Now it hummed with the electric tension of a courtroom before a verdict. Fitzgerald's secretary led us through the waiting room with the efficiency of someone who'd done this dance before, her heels clicking against hardwood floors that suddenly seemed to echo like gunshots. My family walked ahead of me in formation, Carlos leading with the false confidence of someone who'd convinced himself that bluster could substitute for innocence. Elena followed close behind, her designer handbag clutched like armor against her side. Patricia brought up the rear, her usual regal bearing replaced by the careful steps of someone walking across unstable ground. I stayed behind them, playing my role as the damaged veteran who needed family guidance to navigate complex legal matters. But internally, I was cataloging every detail the way I'd been trained to assess tactical situations: exit routes, sight lines, defensive positions. Old habits from a different kind of warfare, but the skills translated perfectly to civilian battlefields. Fitzgerald's office had been rearranged since my last visit. The comfortable chairs were positioned in a semicircle facing his desk, creating the atmosphere of an interrogation rather than a friendly family meeting. A digital recorder sat prominently on the polished wood surface, its red recording light already blinking. On the credenza behind him, an old cassette player waited like a loaded weapon. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Fitzgerald said, his voice carrying none of the warmth he'd shown during our private meeting. "I've discovered some information that requires immediate clarification." Carlos settled into his chair with forced casualness, crossing his legs and folding his hands as if this were just another routine business meeting. "Of course, Jonathan. We're happy to help clear up any confusion." "Confusion," Fitzgerald repeated, reaching for a manila folder, thick enough to stop small-caliber bullets. "That's an interesting word choice, Carlos. Because what I've found isn't confusing at all. It's quite clear, actually." Elena's purse strap slipped from her shoulder, and she caught it with movements that were just slightly too quick, too sharp. "What exactly have you found?" Instead of answering immediately, Fitzgerald opened the folder and spread documents across his desk like evidence at a crime scene. Bank records, wire transfer receipts, tax forms with signatures that looked familiar, even from across the room. My signatures, or very good forgeries of them. "Let's start with the timeline," Fitzgerald said, pulling out a single sheet of paper and holding it up to the light from his window. "Maya, according to these documents, you signed the charitable donation paperwork on March 28th. Do you remember that date?" I frowned slightly, playing the role of someone struggling with medication-induced memory problems. "Not specifically. Like I mentioned before, everything from that period feels foggy." "Understandable," Fitzgerald nodded. "Grief and medication can certainly affect memory. But here's what's interesting about March 28th. He turned his computer monitor toward us, displaying what looked like a calendar marked with appointments and notes. "According to your medical records from the VA hospital, you were in a 72-hour psychiatric hold from March 26th through March 29th. You were physically incapable of signing any documents during that period." The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic noise from the street, no air conditioning hum, no sound except Patricia's sharp intake of breath and the steady tick of an antique clock that suddenly seemed loud as a metronome counting down to an execution. Carlos was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled but missing its usual confidence. "There must be some mistake with the dates. Medical records aren't always accurate, especially during emotional situations." "I thought the same thing," Fitzgerald said mildly. "So I confirmed the timeline with the hospital. They were very thorough in their documentation." Maya was admitted, after a severe panic episode triggered by anniversary reactions to combat trauma. She was under constant supervision and medical sedation for the entire period. Elena's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Hospital records can be wrong. Dates get mixed up in computer systems all the time. "Which is why I dug deeper," Fitzgerald continued, his voice gaining strength like a prosecutor building toward a closing argument. "The signature on these donation documents was analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert. The results are quite illuminating." He pulled out another document, this one bearing official letterhead from a forensic laboratory. "The signature exhibits characteristics consistent with traced forgery. Hesitation marks, unnatural pen pressure, microscopic tremors that indicate careful reproduction rather than natural muscle memory." Carlos's leg uncrossed abruptly, his foot hitting the floor harder than necessary. "Handwriting analysis isn't always reliable. People's signatures change when they're under stress or taking medication." "True," Fitzgerald agreed. "But signatures don't typically change this dramatically." He reached toward the cassette player behind him, his hand hovering over the play button like a judge reaching for a gavel. "Which brings me to the most interesting piece of evidence I've discovered." Patricia's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What evidence?" "A recording," Fitzgerald said simply. "Made in this office 20 years ago, when Roberto was concerned about potential family disputes over his will. He recorded every meeting that took place here, including conversations that occurred when he wasn't present." Elena's purse slipped entirely from her hands, hitting the floor with a sound like a small explosion. "Recordings of what?" Fitzgerald's finger moved toward the play button. "Recordings of family members discussing how to forge Maya's signature and steal her inheritance. Recordings of detailed conversations about exploiting her military trauma to justify theft. Recordings of 3 people congratulating themselves on successfully defrauding a veteran who'd served her country with honor." Carlos stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the wall. "This is ridiculous. We would never—" "Sit down, Carlos," Fitzgerald said quietly, "and listen to your own voice explaining exactly how you plan to steal your sister's trust fund." His finger pressed the play button, and suddenly the room filled with voices I knew as well as my own heartbeat. But hearing them describe their betrayal in their own words, hearing them laugh about my trauma and plan my financial destruction, was like taking shrapnel to the chest all over again. The recording played for exactly 93 seconds before Fitzgerald stopped it. In those 93 seconds, my family's carefully constructed narrative collapsed completely, buried under the weight of their own confessions. When the silence returned, it was the quiet of a battlefield after the shooting stops. Heavy with smoke and consequence, pregnant with the understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath of that 93-second recording was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Elena sat frozen in her chair, staring at the cassette player as if it might spontaneously combust and erase the evidence it had just revealed. Carlos remained standing, his face cycling through emotions so rapidly I could barely track them. Shock, denial, anger, and finally, a kind of hollow resignation. Patricia was the first to break, not with tears or dramatic confessions, but with the calculated damage control of someone who'd spent decades managing family crises. "Jonathan, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the context of that conversation." Fitzgerald raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding about Elena saying, 'The signature looks perfect. Maya's been so out of it since she got back, she won't question anything?' We were discussing how to help Maya," Patricia continued, her voice gaining strength, as she fell back on familiar patterns of manipulation. "She was in no condition to make major financial decisions. We were protecting her from the stress of managing a large inheritance." I watched this performance with the detached fascination of someone observing enemy tactics from a safe distance. Even faced with incontrovertible evidence of their crimes, they were still trying to reframe theft as protection, forgery as family care. And the part where Carlos said, "She'll never know the money went into our accounts instead?" Fitzgerald asked, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the explosive nature of the evidence. "How exactly does that qualify as protection?" Carlos finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than his usual polished confidence. "We invested the money on her behalf. The foundation was always meant to benefit Maya indirectly, through tax advantages and charitable recognition." "Tax advantages," Fitzgerald repeated slowly. "For a woman who was hospitalized during the alleged signing and therefore couldn't have legally authorized any financial transactions." Elena stirred from her catatonic state, reaching for her purse with movements that seemed disconnected from conscious thought. "I need to call my attorney." "That's certainly your right," Fitzgerald said. "Though I should mention that I've already been in contact with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Wire fraud involving amounts over $100,000 falls under federal jurisdiction." The FBI. The words hit the room like a flashbang grenade, disorienting and devastating. Carlos sank back into his chair as if his legs had suddenly forgotten how to support his weight. Elena's face went from pale to gray, the color of concrete, in winter shadows. "Federal charges?" Patricia whispered. And for the first time since I'd known her, she looked every one of her 68 years. "Wire fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and elder abuse," Fitzgerald enumerated with the precision of someone reading from a legal textbook. The elder abuse charge applies because Roberto was over 65 when he established the trust, and the fraud was committed against his estate. I shifted in my chair, finally breaking the silence I'd maintained throughout this entire confrontation. "What happens now?" All eyes turned to me, and I saw something I'd never witnessed before in my family's faces when they looked at me. Fear. Not fear of legal consequences or financial ruin, but fear of me, of what I might do with the power that had just shifted entirely into my hands. "That depends," Fitzgerald said carefully, "on what Maya decides to do with this information." Carlos leaned forward, desperation replacing his earlier arrogance. "Maya, we're family. We can work this out between ourselves without involving federal prosecutors." "Work it out," I repeated, tasting the words like something foreign and bitter. "The way we worked out my inheritance?" Elena tried a different approach, her voice taking on the pleading tone she'd used when we were children and she'd broken something valuable. "We never meant to hurt you. Everything we did was because we love you and wanted to protect you." Love, protection. The same words they'd been using as weapons for 3 years, turning my trust against me and my trauma into their justification. But sitting in that law office, surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, those words had lost all meaning. "The recording continues for another 22 minutes, Fitzgerald said quietly. "Would you like to hear the part where they discuss what they'll do if you ever figure out what they've stolen? Where they plan to have you declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized?" Patricia's wine-glass composure finally shattered. Completely. "We never would have done that. It was just contingency planning in case you couldn't handle the truth." Contingency planning. They'd mapped out my psychological destruction as thoroughly as they'd planned my financial robbery. If their theft had been discovered, their backup plan was to have me declared insane and locked away where I couldn't contradict their version of events. "The choice is yours, Maya," Fitzgerald said, his voice gentle but firm. "We can proceed with federal charges, or we can explore other options: full restitution, criminal prosecution, civil litigation, or some combination thereof." I looked around the room at these 3 people who'd raised me, who'd taught me about family loyalty and unconditional love, who'd spent 20 years planning to steal my inheritance and destroy my credibility if I ever discovered their crime. The girl who'd left for basic training 8 years ago might have chosen forgiveness. She might have accepted their explanations about protection and family solidarity, might have been grateful for any resolution that didn't involve criminal charges and federal prison, but the woman sitting in that chair had learned hard lessons about the difference between love and manipulation, between protection and control, between family and predators who shared your DNA. The decision I was about to make would change everything, not just for them, but for me. Once I chose my path forward, there would be no going back to the illusion of family unity, no pretending that blood relations meant more than honor and trust. The recording had given me the truth. Now I had to decide what justice looked like, when the people who'd betrayed you were the same ones who'd taught you the meaning of betrayal in the first place. I stood up slowly, the way I'd learned to move in hostile territory when any sudden motion might trigger an ambush. But this time, I was the one with superior firepower, and everyone in the room knew it. The silence stretched between us like a tripwire, dangerous and electric with possibility. 22 more minutes, I said quietly, my voice carrying the kind of calm that comes after the storm has passed and the damage assessment begins. 22 minutes of you planning to have me declared insane if I ever figured out what you'd done. Carlos reached toward me, his hand extending across the space between our chairs, like someone offering a peace treaty after unconditional surrender. Maya, please. We're family. We raised you. We love you. I looked at his outstretched hand, remembering all the times it had helped me up when I'd fallen, signed permission slips for school trips, applauded at my high school graduation, the same hand that had forged my signature to steal my inheritance. You're right, I said, stepping back from his reach. You did raise me. You taught me about loyalty, about trust, about protecting the people you love. I paused, letting the words settle in the air like dust after an explosion. Which is why this hurts so much more than if strangers had robbed me. Elena made a sound, somewhere between a sob and a laugh. We can fix this, Maya. We can transfer the money back, make everything right. The foundation accounts can be dissolved, the investments liquidated. You'll have every penny back, plus interest. Plus interest, I repeated, and this time I did laugh, though there was no humor in the sound. Like you're returning a loan instead of stolen property. Patricia rose from her chair with the careful dignity of someone trying to maintain authority in an impossible situation. Mija, what do you want from us? How do we make this right? What did I want? For 8 years, I'd wanted their approval, their love, their acceptance of the woman I'd become, instead of grief for the girl I'd been. For 3 years, I'd wanted them to see past my trauma to the strength that had carried me through 2 combat deployments. For 3 days, since learning about their betrayal, I'd wanted justice. But sitting in that law office, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd believed about family and love and loyalty, I realized what I really wanted was something none of them could give me. I wanted the innocence back. The ability to trust without calculation, to love without reservation, to believe that the people who'd raised me actually had my best interests at heart. I want my grandfather's trust fund returned to the account he established for me, I said, my voice steady as a sniper's aim. Every penny, plus the interest it would have earned in legitimate investments. I want the fraudulent foundation dissolved and all assets recovered. Fitzgerald was taking notes, his pen moving across legal paper with practiced efficiency. That can be arranged. What about criminal prosecution? This was the moment that would define everything that came after. The choice between justice and mercy, between punishment and redemption. I looked at Carlos, who'd taught me to drive, at Elena, who'd helped me pick out my prom dress, at Patricia, who'd made my favorite tamales every Christmas morning. Then I thought about the 22 minutes of recording where they'd planned to have me institutionalized for discovering their crime. About 3 years of gaslighting designed to make me doubt my own judgment. About the careful way they'd used my military trauma as a weapon against me. No criminal prosecution, I said finally. But I want signed confessions from all 3 of you, admitting to wire fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. Confessions that will be held in escrow by Mr. Fitzgerald. If any of you ever try to claim I was mentally incompetent, if you ever try to challenge my decisions or my judgment, if you ever again try to use my military service against me, those confessions go directly to federal prosecutors. The proposal hung in the air like a suspended sentence, offering them freedom in exchange for permanent leverage over their futures. Carlos's face cycled through relief and resignation before settling on something that might have been respect. And there's one more condition, I continued, reaching for the folder I'd brought from home. I want you to read this letter I wrote, out loud, to each other. I pulled out 3 sheets of paper, each one identical, each one containing words I'd written during the sleepless hours after learning about their betrayal. Words about trust and trauma, about family and forgiveness, about the difference between protection and control. The letter explains exactly how your protection felt. From my perspective, I said, handing each of them a copy. How it felt to be treated like a broken child instead of a combat veteran. How it felt to have my trauma weaponized against me by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Elena took her copy with shaking hands, her eyes scanning, the first few lines before looking away. Maya, I don't think— Read it, I said. And for the first time in 3 years, my voice carried the authority I'd learned in places where hesitation could get people killed. All of it, to each other. Because if you really want to understand how to make this right, you need to understand what you actually did to me. The silence that followed was different from all the others. This wasn't the quiet of people waiting for bad news or calculating damage control strategies. This was the silence of people finally being forced to confront the full scope of their actions, to see their protection through the eyes of their victim. Patricia was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. We'll read it. We'll sign the confessions. We'll return every penny. She looked up from the letter, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before when she looked at me. Not pity or concern or condescending love, but recognition. And then? And then we figure out if there's anything left of this family worth saving. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Maya Rodriguez Veterans Transition Center, watching young soldiers navigate the same challenges I'd faced 3 years earlier. The $437,000 had been returned with interest, but more importantly, it had been invested in something my grandfather would have truly approved of, helping veterans find their footing in a world that didn't always understand what they'd sacrificed. Elena walked through the front door carrying a box of donated supplies, her designer suits replaced by jeans and the kind of practical clothing that comes with actual work instead of just managing other people's money. She nodded at me, the same careful acknowledgement we'd maintained since the confessions were signed. The Phoenix VA referred 3 more clients this week, she said, setting down the box. All struggling with family reintegration issues. Patricia emerged from the conference room where she'd been leading a support group for military families. At 70, she'd found a purpose that didn't involve controlling other people's lives, and the change had been remarkable. Maya, the group wants to know if you'll speak next week about financial fraud prevention. Carlos appeared from the computer lab where he'd been teaching resume writing to transitioning veterans. His construction company now hired exclusively from our program, giving former soldiers practical skills and steady employment. We weren't the same family we'd been before. That version had been built on illusions and unequal power dynamics that could never be rebuilt. But we'd found something different, something honest. A shared commitment to helping other people avoid the betrayals we'd inflicted on each other. I'll speak to the group, I said, watching new veterans walk through doors that led to genuine support instead of manipulation disguised as care. The trust fund had bought more than financial security. It had bought the truth, and the truth had set us all free. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more true stories about resilience, justice, and the power of never giving up. Your support helps us share these important narratives with people who need to hear them.